How to Read a Book is the classic guide to reading effectively. It teaches how to understand the crux of a book within 15 minutes, how to analyze a book intelligently, and how to synthesize ideas from multiple books. Reading is an active activity, not a passive one. So if you read a lot of books, it makes sense to learn how to increase the value of your reading. Part 1. The premise of how to read. According to the authors, after you learn phonics as a child and go through high school English, no one really teaches you how to read intelligently. College courses rarely touch on this, and the workforce even less so. As a result, plenty of adults read at an elementary level, not in the sense of having a limited vocabulary, but in absorbing the value of a book efficiently. Short-form note: this holds just as true today as it did in 1972. One study found that 43 million American adults have low literacy skills. The authors believe there are two types of active reading. Note that this does not include reading for pure entertainment, which is a relatively passive pursuit in terms of cognitive effort. Reading to collect facts. The authors argue that if you understand the book completely without exerting any extra effort, then you have only gained information from the book. You haven't improved your understanding. You've simply added to your existing collection of facts on the subject. Reading for comprehension. When you read for comprehension, the authors believe that you won't glean all the meaning from the book on the very first try. Instead of just adding to your collection of facts on a subject, the book will challenge you to find new ways to think about those facts or relate them to one another. You'll begin to think about not just what is the case, but why it is the case. This type of reading expands your understanding and increases your reading skills. In 19th century America, all reading was reading for comprehension. The authors believe that reading for comprehension is a unique type of reading, distinct from reading for information. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, author Neil Postman argues that classifying reading for comprehension as just one category of reading is a modern idea because, in the past, there were no alternatives. All reading was for the purpose of comprehension because print was the most accessible medium for sharing ideas. In other words, reading was such a critical part of early American society that deeply understanding what you read was crucial. How did reading for comprehension evolve into its own, separate task? Postman argues that two inventions changed the nature of reading in 19th century America, the first being the telegraph. The invention of the telegraph made it possible to communicate short bursts of information across great distances. Over time, the country evolved from a slow, print-centered intellectual culture to one that valued speed and quantity of information over relevance. Reading the Federalist Papers and thoughtfully debating the contents with your family was out. Glossing over eye-catching headlines of news from around the world was in. The development of modern photography also contributed to this new hunger for information to be delivered in quick, easy-to-digest formats. Instead of slogging through a long book about life in another culture, you could glance at a photograph and immediately get a sense of another world, without all the mental effort of reading. Now, 2 centuries later, we spend our free time scrolling image-based social media platforms. For better or for worse, reading for comprehension has become an entirely separate activity that is no longer a requirement to participate in daily life. 4 key questions to answer while you're reading. The authors assert that if you read for comprehension, you will be able to answer 4 key questions about the book. What is the overall message or theme of the book? This should be a quick synopsis, not a detailed summary. How does the author's argument unfold? What are the main principles and supporting evidence? Is the author's argument valid? Provide evidence to support your opinions. What are the implications? If you agree with the author's argument, how will you act on it? Ideally, the authors recommend you make a habit of asking these questions as you read. Doing this feels clunky at first, but you need to train each skill separately before doing it all subconsciously. A 5th question: the limits of a good idea. As you read, you may also want to ask a crucial question not posed by the authors. What are the limits of the author's good ideas? What would happen if everyone followed this advice all the time? It's rare that an idea is applicable in all situations. For example, In Smarter, Faster, Better, author Charles Duhigg advocates for probabilistic thinking, a decision-making strategy that requires thinking up all the possible outcomes of a given choice and then calculating the likelihood of each of those outcomes. Duhigg argues that thinking probabilistically will increase the accuracy of your predictions and lead to more productive choices. However, if everyone thought probabilistically all the time, we'd lose the ability to be spontaneous or to respond instinctively to any situation. If we thought probabilistically about whether to slam on the brakes when a dog runs into the road, the extra thinking time could have terrible consequences. Therefore, Duhigg's good idea clearly has a limit. Too much of a good thing is a particular concern in self-help books. For example, in The Game, author Neil Strauss presents tips on flirting with women from several self-proclaimed master pickup artists. However, many of these tips, like negging, insulting a woman with a backhanded compliment, could easily escalate into abusive behavior. Thus, if you're reading a book in the self-help or how-to genre, what are the limits of this idea? May be an especially important question to ask. Part 2. Elementary and Inspectional Reading. So far in this guide, we've learned the purpose of reading well and discussed how to choose which books to read. In the next 2 parts, we'll cover the first 3 levels of reading: elementary, inspectional, and analytical, in that order. The authors describe elementary reading as the pure mechanical reading of text and comprehension of what the symbols literally mean. It's the most basic form of reading that we learn to do as a child. As an adult, you revisit the difficulties of elementary reading when you first try to read in a foreign language. Short-form note: the authors spend considerable time discussing the specific steps of learning to read at an elementary level. However, if you're reading this guide, you've already mastered those steps. Therefore, we've condensed this chapter to just the information that is relevant to readers who are proficient in elementary reading and want to improve their higher-level reading skills. After elementary reading, the second level of reading is inspectional. According to the authors, inspectional reading is a skimming of the book to understand its main points and its structure. It aims to gain the best understanding of the book in a limited time. The authors advise setting a target for 15 minutes to comprehend a 300-page book. Short-form note: Adler and Van Doren recommend inspectional reading as a precursor to analytical reading. However, if you don't plan to come back and read the book analytically, you can make the most of reading it inspectionally by putting the book's ideas into practice immediately in your daily life. That way, you'll get the maximum benefit from the information even without a deep, analytical reading. Techniques for inspectional reading. Read the title. Read the preface and the blurb. The author often explains what the book is about and how to tackle it. Read the table of contents. Short-form note: this is less effective if books obfuscate titles to generate a sense of mystery. For example, Ryan Holiday's Ego is the Enemy features chapter titles like To Be or To Do and Follow the Canvas Strategy. Without reading the book, it's impossible to get a sense of what those chapters contain. Scan the index for a range of topics covered. More important topics will have more pages. Find the main chapters of the book and read the summary areas of those chapters. The summary areas are often at the end of the chapter or the end of each major section. Flip through the book to get a general sense of the book's pacing and how the author's argument will unfold. Short-form note: this list of techniques is not exhaustive and doesn't take into account 21st century resources like online reviews and summaries. To take advantage of these new resources, try reading the top Amazon reviews of the book or scanning through one of our book guides to get a sense of the book's main arguments. Additionally, you may want to read the book's introduction and spend time looking at any charts, graphs, or images. Part 3. Analytical Reading. According to the authors, the aim of analytical reading is to, without imposing any time restraints, gain the best understanding of the book possible. Not only should you aim to understand what is being said, but you should also develop a personal opinion about its validity. Short-form note: in addition to forming a judgment about the book's validity, you might think about what parts of the book were most impactful and will stay with you over time. Adler and Van Doren believe the first step of analytical reading is to understand the author's goals in writing the book. This requires finding out what problems the author is trying to solve and what questions the book tries to answer. Short-form note. This task is a bit more complicated for fiction works, as different readers can come away with different understandings of the author's intent. How to find keywords. In the step above, you figured out what questions the author is trying to answer. Now, Adler and Van Doren argue you need to comprehend what the book is actually saying and what arguments the author makes in relation to her questions. To find what the book says, Adler and Van Doren advise looking for keywords. Keywords are meaningful words or phrases that are used often and convey a wealth of information. As a reader, you need to understand the keywords of the author and what is meant by them. This is especially important because the same word can mean different things to different authors. Short-form note. Be sure to look for keywords early in the revision process, otherwise you may misunderstand the author's arguments in the rest of the book. For example, in A Brief History of Time, author and physicist Stephen Hawking uses the word theory in a very specific, scientific way, not in the colloquial sense as a simple synonym for the word idea. To really understand the rest of the book, it's crucial to understand how Hawking defines that keyword. How do you find keywords? Adler and Van Doren provide 2 clues to identifying the most important terms in a book. First, a word is probably important if the author deliberately uses it differently than other writers do, particularly if the author makes a point to explain why those other writers' definitions are incorrect or incomplete. Second, if you struggle to understand how an author is using a particular word, that's a sign that the word is important. Authors frequently use keywords in unique ways to express their most important and, often, most complex ideas. More tips on how to find keywords. The process of finding keywords in a text can differ based on the type of text and the way you approach it. For example, shorter works like articles often feature keywords in predefined places, such as the first sentence of the article, the last sentence of the first paragraph, and in any repeated phrase throughout the piece. Additionally, if you already know something about what you're reading, that can help you identify the keywords. For example, if you're reading Darwin's The Origin of Species, you probably know that Darwin's ideas were part of the theory of evolution, so you'll know to keep an eye out for evolution as a keyword. You can also look for synonyms and related words or phrases, like heredity or survival of the fittest. How to find key sentences. After identifying keywords, Adler and Van Doren recommend finding the author's leading propositions in her most important sentences. Important sentences express parts of the author's argument. Here are some tips on how to find them. Special sentences may be formatted stylistically or set apart, for example, with italics or underlining. The important words are often contained in the important sentences. Therefore, if you spot a keyword, pay special attention to the sentence it's located in. Pay attention to words that confuse you, rather than words that grab your interest. Short-form note. Remember, the goal of analytical reading is to increase your understanding. It's perfectly fine to pause at a particularly interesting or entertaining sentence, but if your goal is to better understand the author's ideas, your time is better spent wrestling with sentences you don't immediately understand. Finding key sentences in the digital age. In the modern era, there are other high-tech ways of identifying important sentences that Adler and Van Doren couldn't imagine in 1972. For example, computer programmers in the field of natural language processing have developed algorithms capable of reading digital text and automatically identifying key terms and sentences. This is especially impressive because the program is partly based on the frequency of a given word in a text, but it has to distinguish between common but not useful words, like and, or, the, and the actual keywords of the text. Once the program identifies the keywords based on frequency, it scans every single sentence and highlights those sentences with higher proportions of keywords, which is essentially a computerized version of the process that Adler and Van Doren recommend. Criticizing a book. So far in the reading process, if you've been following Adler and Van Doren's advice, you've been absorbing what the author has to say without criticism or judgment. However, once you fully understand a book, you have a new responsibility as a reader, to argue with it. According to Adler and Van Doren, When criticizing, your job is to determine which of her questions the author has answered, which she has not, and decide if the author knew she had failed to answer them. Short-form note: as you begin this process, you may also want to think about the subject as a whole and ask yourself, are there any important ideas the author didn't mention? Did she leave anything out? If so, how would that missing information change your impression of her argument? Complete your understanding first. Much like having a conversation with an author, Adler and Van Doren contend that you need to give the author the chance to express herself fully before passing judgment. If you interrupted the author at each sentence to say she's wrong, you're not having a conversation that can lead to learning. Therefore, you must finish the other tasks above: outlining the book, defining main terms, understanding the main arguments, before criticizing. Otherwise, your criticism will be meaningless because you won't be criticizing the author's actual argument. Short-form note: you'll need to use your own best judgment to decide if you fully understand the author's arguments. However, if you're new to the book subject, you should be especially cautious about deciding you understand, because the less you know about a subject, the more likely you are to overestimate your understanding. This is the essence of the Dunning-Kruger effect. How to criticize well. In Adler and Van Doren's view, criticizing a book means to comment, "I agree," "I disagree," or "I suspend judgment." When you're criticizing an author, Adler and Van Doren caution against being overly contentious or combative. A discussion isn't something to be won. It's an opportunity to discover the truth. Remember that disagreement is an opportunity to learn something new. Here are some tips for keeping an open mind. Do not play devil's advocate by default. Don't resent the author for being right or teaching you something new. Short-form note: you may be especially tempted to resent the author when they challenge one of your political or religious beliefs. Studies have shown that these beliefs are the most resistant to change because they're intimately tied up with how we see ourselves. Only agree with the author if you've fully evaluated their work. Don't just assume the author is right because they're smart. Short-form note: this may be even harder, and thus even more important, for authors you respect and admire, as you might naturally evaluate those authors' arguments less rigorously than authors with whom you disagree. Separate your emotional reaction to the book from the rational one. As you read, earnestly try to take the author's point of view. Resolving difficult conversations with the author. Separating your emotional reaction to a book from your intellectual reaction and trying to take the author's point of view isn't always easy, especially if the author's argument threatens an aspect of your life or your identity. In that situation, it may help to think of yourself as entering into a difficult conversation with the author. In difficult conversations, authors Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen offer advice for navigating these types of conversations. Remember that our individual experiences shape how we see the world. That means that whatever the author is saying probably isn't meant as an attack on your principles or your identity. It's a reflection of their own life experiences. Keeping this in mind can help you not take the author's ideas personally. Acknowledge and express the feelings that come up as you read. Otherwise, they'll fester and keep you from evaluating the book with a clear head. Try out the "and" stance, in which you acknowledge that several things can be true at once. For example, you might say, "This author has some good ideas, and some of her views are deeply intolerant," or "I'm a good person, and I'm guilty of the behavior this author is criticizing." This allows you to see the bigger picture, not just the most difficult part. Part 4. Comparative Reading. The first 3 levels of reading all focus on reading a singular text. Now, we'll talk about applying those analytical skills across a multitude of texts. Adler and Van Doren call this syntopical reading. Syntopical is a neologism Adler's Encyclopedia Britannica team invented. For simplicity, we'll call this type of reading comparative reading. Comparative reading aims to compare books and authors to one another, to model dialogues between authors that may not be in any one of the books. Short-form note: in How to Read Literature Like a Professor, author Thomas C. Foster describes intertextuality, which is the common references and themes that exist across fiction books. Reading literature with an intertextual lens is similar to reading expository books comparatively. The ultimate aim is to understand all the conflicting viewpoints relating to a subject. Here are the major steps of comparative reading according to the authors. Short-form note. Adler and Van Doren list these as a set of 5 steps, each containing many sub-steps. For clarity, we've expanded the list so that each step is one distinct action. See our full guide for specific tips on reading books in various genres, like fiction, science, and philosophy. 1. Create a total bibliography of works that may be relevant to your subject. Many of the important works may not be obvious, since they may not have the keyword in their titles. Short-form note. In established fields, look for a primer or brief history of your subject. This will give you an overview of the topic and help you identify additional sources. 2. Inspect all of the books on your bibliography to decide which are relevant to your subject and to better define the subject. As you research, you may find that your subject is more difficult to define than you imagined. For example, if your subject is World War II, you'll have more material than you could possibly read. As you begin reading, the authors recommend narrowing down your subject. Short-form note, the ultimate scope of your topic depends on your project. If you love history and want to know everything there is to know about World War II, you might keep the subject broad and make it a lifelong reading project. On the other hand, if your goal is to write a paper for a class, you may want to keep narrowing until you have just enough information to fill a set number of pages. 3. Go through each book on your list and mark specific chapters or passages you intend to use. Keep in mind that only a portion of any given book may be relevant to your purposes. If you plan to read the whole book, read it quickly. You may use a syntopicon that organizes passages across works by subject, like great books of the Western world. Short-form note. The syntopicon is a directory of great ideas that includes every reference to those ideas across 431 great books. It took Adler and his team over 400,000 hours of reading and more than a decade to create. 4. Develop a set of common terms and rephrase each author's argument in that language. Authors in different fields may use entirely different terms that mean the same thing, and the same terms in different fields may mean entirely different things. Short-form note. For scientific or technical topics, you may need to literally translate the author's conclusions into a set of common units. 5. Develop a set of questions that each author provides answers to. This may not be explicit. You may have to infer the author's answer to a question she never directly considered. Short-form note. Take your inferred answers with a grain of salt. Even if you're well-versed in the work of a given author, it's impossible to know for sure how that author would feel about a subject they never addressed. 6. Get a sense of the complexity of the issues. See how each author answers the questions. If their answers are vastly different, it probably means that your question represents a particularly contentious issue in their field. Short-form note. Another clue that you've stumbled on a contentious issue is if a lot of literature is published on that topic in a short amount of time, because authors are constantly rebutting each other. More informally, you may even look to social media or interviews with the authors to see whether they're focused on rebutting another author's ideas. 7. Order the questions and issues to throw maximum light on the subject. Show how the questions are answered differently and say why. Avoid trying to assert the truth or falsity of any view. This fails the goal of the syntopic reading to be objective. According to the authors, full objectivity is difficult to maintain, and bias can show in subtle ways like the summarization of arguments and the ordering of answers. The antidote to this is constant reference to the actual text of the authors. Short-form note. Keep in mind that bias can persist even when you're actively trying to be objective. Psychologists have shown this through the implicit association test, which tests implicit social biases. Participants know they're being tested on bias, and therefore may be deliberately trying to appear unbiased, but those biases are so deeply rooted that they appear anyway. The authors suggest omitting imaginative works from comparative reading, because the propositions are obscured by plot and are rarely explicitly attributed to the author, A character's speech could be satirical. Short-form note. Including fiction in a comparative project is complicated indeed, but may still be valuable. For example, reading only historical accounts of 18th-century English and Irish politics without reading Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, or of ancient Greece without reading the works of Homer or Sophocles, would be a major omission, despite the influence of fiction. Comparative reading versus literature review. In academic settings, literature reviews are a common undertaking. Literature reviews are similar to comparative reading projects in that the goal is to gain a wide understanding of what other thinkers have to say about a certain subject. Researchers conducting literature reviews often complete extra steps that Adler and Doren don't mention in their discussion of comparative reading. However, these steps might be useful for comparative reading projects. For example, define your inclusion criteria. Literature reviews have strict inclusion criteria to help determine which sources to use. For example, many literature reviews only pull sources from academic journals, not popular press books or even textbooks. If you need to narrow down your comparative reading bibliography, you might set similar parameters on the types of sources you want to use. Create a table to keep track of different authors' viewpoints. This will help you keep all your information in one place as you work through your bibliography. You can even color-code authors who are in favor of a certain issue or against it. Analyze the quality of your source. For scientific topics, researchers can do this mathematically by analyzing effect size and statistical significance. For qualitative topics, you might do this by researching the author. What is their experience in this subject? For translated texts, you might also research the translator and the history of translation for that specific text. Are there any passages that different translators have approached differently?